Great, thank you, Cappy. So my first presentation today is really on the background of the lab, its collection and the research. And I'm going to start with these two. I'm not sure if people recognize these. These are some printed later, you might say, Lewis Hine photographs that were brought to the studio in the late 1990s. These are actually fraudulent prints. They were sold as genuine Lewis Hine photographs. Lewis Hine, of course, died in 1940. And these were circulating in the market in the 80s, late 80s and the 90s. And it was my, I was pretty young. And I sort of naively took this on as like, this is not going to be such a big deal. I can figure this out. When were these objects made? And it quickly got out of control. And this is, I just got this. This is a journalist got. These are copies from the FBI file on this case. So that's my report on the right, submitted in November of '99. And I was very anxious. And I want you to feel a little anxious right now, too. What if you just don't know when something was made? How do you know? How do you know? How do you assess whether you have an authentic connection to the artist, the moment of creation, or not? And I thought, this is going to be straightforward. And it was so layered and so nuanced and so hard. And in the end, when I wrote this report, I had a lot of good data, but I'm not sure it would have held up in court, honestly. And that's how I imagined. I had a feeling this is where it was going, that I would be, just destroyed under cross-examination. But, the horse had left the barn, so to speak. There are a couple more pages. So I sent this report. I think I submitted the report on the 6th. I forget what I said. I could go back, but I'm not going to do it. Well, it popped up in the Times. This is all from the FBI report. They had a copy of the Times article. So 6 days later, the momentum, this was, the lid had kind of blown off this thing. And I was kind of feeling exposed, to say the least. On the left were some of this, so-called sort of facts that I had assembled. These prints had some back printing. They had an AGFA logo. There's a little, again, redacted email on the bottom from a representative that I was working with in AGFA that said, that's the wrong logo. And I'm pretty sure, these prints had optical brightening. I'm pretty sure that we didn't use optical brighteners into the 50s. So, okay, so that is sort of like that's really the beginning, is an impulse for, I think, almost self-preservation. I needed to ground the assertions I was making in material fact. And right around this time, of course, this is kind of, in a way, the end-ish of analog photography. And I was in a photography store. Every small town had a store, somewhere on Main Street. You get your photographs developed back in the day, sold used cameras, things like that. And he was closing up, shutting down the shop. And I was talking to him, and he, I told him I was interested in, papers and, the history of papers, and he gave me this. And so this is collection item number 1. And as I didn't realize it at the time, but with a little bit of, a couple of days thinking about it, these are amazing. Sample books are amazing. I mean, just the fashion and the hair and just across the board. So this is from the 70s, of course. I got to here, and it's like, oh, okay. There's a language. There's like order to this. This is not like some, black box. This is, if I work on this, I can figure this out. So this is like the back of the book where all of the codes, the surfaces, the gloss, the texture, it's all sort of laid out for you, kind of schematically in this case. And it's like, this is the language. This is the language I need to know. I need to learn. I had never, and so the collection was born. It's about 7,000 or so examples here. This is a visualization from Paperbase. Damon's going to talk about Paperbase. I never conceived that this collection would essentially transform into an academic, a scholarly resource. That was not the point, at least at the time. The point was to give me the confidence, the material grounding, so I would never be in that position again of just not knowing when an object was produced, how it was produced, and everything that goes along with that. I realized, there was, another inflection point, sort of, the end of the analog era. And if anybody was going to collect it, they had to get to work right now. It had to happen now. And so that's when, my kids were all on first name basis with, the UPS driver and the FedEx, because they were coming literally every day, bringing materials that I was getting principally on eBay. And so it's the classification of this universe of papers that really became the kind of the guiding principle of my work in those decades, but certainly is the foundation for the Lens Media Lab. And so how do you classify paper? And that was a sort of an essential thing. Okay, to have it is one thing, but to turn it into data, well, that's a whole other thing. And it kind of dawned on me that, well, you just have to look at a package of paper. It'll tell you what's important. So this is a haloid. Haloid actually became the Xerox company. They got out of the photography business and into other things. But I think this is from the 1920s. So the package tells you it's Japanese parchment. Well, okay, that's referring to its texture. It's got sort of this parchment tactile sort of attributes. So that's the texture. Here's the gloss, the reflectance. How does it interact with light, with incident light? Does it bounce it back to your eye, or does it scatter it? Tells you what color it is, what base color it is. And then, how thick it is. How much space does it take up? How much volume does it take up? And that was, this was like so clear, right? I mean, every paper doesn't have to even be photographic paper. And in fact, everything has these properties. And these are all things that we can measure. And this is a vintage slide from Object Photo, which Cappy mentioned. This goes back to 2012. And I think one of my principal contributions, I suppose, to Object Photo was figuring out ways to measure all of these things. And so, okay, so here's this great Lersky photograph from the MoMA collection. And I can describe the thickness, I can tell you the gloss, I can tell you how warm or cool the base color is. I can tell you the texture is 4.9 scale 1 pseudo area scale fractal analysis. And you will look at me like I'm out of my mind, because without context, none of this really makes any sense at all. And so that became kind of the next challenge, was to put this in context. By the way, we don't measure texture using pseudo area scale fractal analysis anymore. We have a much more direct method. So let's just provide some context. Well, if you go back to the collection and you make a lot of thickness measurements, you get a chart that looks something like this. So we see, double weight papers, we see single weight papers. If you're paying attention, you might see, hey, single weight paper is actually a little thinner prior to 1930. Well, that's interesting. And so now we have all of these measurements. We have context. And so that Lursky photograph comes in around here. It's about 0.175 millimeters. So it's right in the heart of single weight papers made, after, let's say, 1930. And you can see, well, about maybe, let's say, a quarter of papers are thinner than that, and about 3/4 of the paper are thicker than that. Okay, so that's the context that I'm talking about. So now we can get rid of 0.172 millimeters. We don't need that anymore. And we can say, okay, this is where it falls relative to the genome of photographic papers. And we can do that for gloss, color, texture, that kind of thing. And not being happy with that, I wanted to create kind of something like a graphical thumbprint, a graphical fingerprint for that paper. And so just rearranging the axes a little bit and putting the warm on the exterior, rough on the exterior, matte, thick papers on the exterior, kind of created here. These are the same little slider points that I just showed a second ago, and just fill them in. And this has become, that was the principal invention that I was working on, I guess, at MoMA during object photo. And once we had that fingerprint that describes this physical object, we can do interesting things with it. We can compare it. So there's another Lursky print at the MFA in Houston. That's shown on the right in the green. And we can compare the physical properties. And we can see, oh, okay, not the same paper, that's for sure. Some qualities are very similar. It's got similar gloss and similar base color, but it's way thicker. What does a thicker paper mean? Well, maybe it means it was made for exhibition versus pre-press or publication. We don't know, but it's definitely different. And maybe that goes to different intention, different purpose. Can also start thinking about these qualities in kind of, again, I was talking about this, there's an idea of a language here. And there certainly is a language. We're comparing two Gevaert papers here. On the left is large X, and it's a photo finishing paper. And the graphics tell you pretty much everything you need to know. The faster they come, the better you'll like it. In other words, you'll make money using this paper. It's got if you read the fine print, it's got a large latitude. Terrible negatives will, this paper will work. And so it's about being practical. It's about being kind of utilitarian. And look where it falls on the glyph. That's the blue diamond in the center. So it's really thin. It's got a cool base color. It's very reflective. It's very glossy. And it's got a relatively smooth surface. And then I'm comparing it on the right to another paper by Gevaert, which is the most beautiful paper ever made. And that's what they say. I didn't make that. So your best summer pictorial, right? So this is also telling you what you need to know about this paper. If you have aspirations to be an artist, if you have aspirations to express yourself through this medium, to interpret, this is the paper for you. And it's also, I think, one of the favorites of Alison Rossiter, who's, right? Alison, because it's a very expressive paper. I mean, it's a remarkable paper. When you hold it, you can see that it's special. And it fills the glyph. It's, again, this is all compared to sort of the baseline of all of our measurements, thousands of measurements. It's got a warm tone. It's super matte. It's super rough. And it's super thick. It's really assertive as an object. And then you can start, if you start reading these things, you start interpreting the images, you start thinking about just really the history of photography and what papers photographers chose at what time, you can start coming up with these sort of languages. So like that small glyph, right? It's very glossy, it's very thin, it's very, has a very white, almost cool base. It's got a really smooth texture. It's about objectivity. It's about information. The paper has to get out of the way because the photographer cares about the detail that it's showing. It's really glossy. And what does that gloss do? That gloss increases what's known as optical saturation, makes the blacks really inky, wet-looking blacks. If you do that, if you have a darker black and you have a whiter white on the other side, you have a lot more information that you can pack into that tonal range. Contrast, if you have a matte paper, you're compressing that range. If you have a rough surface, you're breaking up that detail. So these are subjective papers. These are papers that signal, the photographer is telling you, this is my interpretation. This is my art. This is a creation. Now you can use these, like surrealist photographers would opt for, the papers in blue because they want you to believe the principal conceit is like, this is real. And that's the tension, right? If you put that same image on a paper that's signaling, this is my interpretation, it's blurring out detail, it probably will not have the same impact. So what we talk about here in the lab, and this is going to come up probably, are on the left, we talk about a paper's being expressive. And typically, what we're saying is the papers in green are the most expressive papers, the papers that fill the glyph. It's not talking about prints, right? You can have an expressive print on a non-expressive paper, for sure. But, think pictorialism, think about the papers that were used by, pictorialist photographers, right? They, often they're on very rough papers, again, to like break up detail, very warm papers. It gives you this idea of almost, there's a temporal aspect to the color, right? You start thinking about the past, you start thinking about longer timelines. It's not as immediate. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts that are at the foundation of the lab, really. Having scale, measuring that scale, and then once you have those measurements, how do you build a language around that? How do you interpret that? How do you put those to use today to support scholarship? I look at this, John Atherton, who's here, he always tries to make us look good. And I told you I would talk a little bit about the origins of the lab. That was a little bit of prehistory. I look at this and I kind of wince because, like I said, John tries to make us look good. So here I am, posing as like this great, visionary at the beginning of the. I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I coming here. Coming out of private practice as a conservator and then sort of heading up a research lab, I really didn't know what I was doing, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm not trying to be humble. I was a bit lost. But it was a good challenge. And it was John Pritzker that kind of put me up to that challenge. For personal reasons, he wanted to do something for Yale. He and I had worked together on his collection, particularly Man Ray photographs, for a number of years. He knew about the collection. We had talked about this work at length. I kind of laid out, all of my aspirations, what this collection could do. And I think principally he wanted the collection to get into a research university. I think he recognized its importance as a scholarly asset. In fact, probably before I did. John's also a person who, he's a very incisive collector. And he definitely thought about information from the collection helping to maybe even out some of the asymmetries in the marketplace, where the buyer, not necessarily sure what the relationship is between the print and its moment of creation. And sometimes the seller doesn't know either, frankly. But it was an opportunity. He felt, I think, strongly that it was an opportunity to not replace connoisseurship, but maybe put that connoisseurship on a more solid material-based foundation. And you'll notice, too, that there's the word endowment. Initially, the lab was set up as an endowment. And if you know what that means, it's sort of like living on a savings account. You've got a lot of money in the bank, but not a lot of money to work with, right? And so I had enough money to kind of pay my salary, but that was not going to achieve my ambition at all. And so those early years, it was a lot of turmoil. And at a certain point, it became clear that the only way we were going to get any work done was to break the endowment, convert it from a savings account to a checking account. And that's really when we started to build the lab. And this is the lab as it stands today. You're going to hear from all of these amazing, talented people throughout the day. All of the work that's being presented is really their work. Incredibly proud of this group. Also proud of this group. This is a lot of alums, and you might, some of you might recognize yourself in here. And, if you need someone to vouch for the capacity for philanthropy to change people's lives, you just have to, give me a call. Because, I see so many young people here who have been really brought into the field through John Pritzker's gift and generosity. And with that, I think that's the background. That's everything you need to know. Let's start the laser show.